Greetings and various assorted salutations. This lecture is a little bit different from the other ones I've given thus far. While this is for a U.S. History 3 section of my course in the lecture series, this is actually a lecture that is based off of something I put together for a world history guest lecture talk I gave a few years back. I've updated it and upgraded it from its original to make it fit in more with this class, but it's based on something a bit older that I've worked on. And it is on communism. Let's roll on through. Communism is one of those words that's sometimes slinged as a slur. Others see it as an opportunity for a better world. It pops up a lot in the news, and sometimes the word socialism is thrown around as well. This lecture intends to kind of clarify what was communism by looking at its fundamental ideas, where it's coming from, and its attempted application in the political economic world of the Cold War. Since this is a history lecture, we're a bit less concerned with the present of it, because presumably having a more historic understanding of communism should help us students better understand what it means going forward in the future. And perhaps understanding the past of it will help us better understand where it is in the present and whatnot. I am going to admit I do have a few biases. I am an American who likes to study European history, and two, I like private property. There, moving on. Where does communism come from? The origins of communism. Communism is an ideology that comes out of the horrors of the European Industrial Revolution. Karl Marx, pictured here, and Friedrich Engels are two of the major initial theorists, but they're not the only ones with these ideas. But they are the ones who their writings, particularly Marx's, serve as the foundation for modern communist states and their literature. But Marx and Engels lived in the 1840s, and they saw the plight of the working class in the industrializing places like England and the rest of Europe. This was long, miserable hours in dangerous, dark, inhumane factories that consumed the poor, men, women, and children of Europe, crushing them. Almost looking at them as not human, but part of the machines they worked on and with. According to Marx, industrialization created a society that was unequal between those who labored and those who owned the means of labor. And what this meant is that the factory worker was often paid very little for the many hours of toil, while their owners enjoyed very large profits from the products sold that these factory workers were making. It created a sense of alienation and exploitation of workers, but because the workers themselves were seen as disposable and replaceable, much like the gears of a machine, which is what was seen as an issue here. But Karl Marx, one of the initial writers, he was a German academic. He developed a few different documents that are used to better understand communism. And essentially what he does is he creates a system, an alternative to the Industrial Revolution and the capitalism, the rampant capitalism out of the Industrial Revolution. To give you a breakdown of it, Marx, ever the European academic, labeled the working class with the French term proletariat, and the middle class, the owning class, as the bourgeois, sometimes called the bourgeoisie. You may hear these mispronunciations regularly, or pronunciations, depending on who you talk to, because, quite frankly, most of the people who use these terms are not French. So, some pronunciation of those terms is quite normal. Various things. And essentially, what this is the working class are the people who are laborers. They make money off the sweat of their brow kind of mentality, whereas the bourgeois, the owning class, are the ones who own the factories or manage the factories. And they kind of, according to Marxism, oversee the oppression of the working class. And essentially, Marx is also a historian. He's many things. Marxist communism according to the worldview of Marx, argues that all throughout human history there is this struggle versus the worker and the owner classes, and that the suffering of the working proletariat is created by the suffering of the working class is created by the decadence of the owners of the means of production. And the solution to this historical struggle, because Karl Marx sees this as a ongoing, ever-evolving struggle between the workers and the owners. The solution is that the workers must seize the means of production and remove them from the bourgeois' hands. And how this becomes applied is that the whole system must be destroyed, this exploitive system. Marx argued that only through revolution and violence that the working class could drive the bourgeois out of their places of power, and then the working class could form a new world based on the workers and the factories and sharing the profits of their labors equally amongst everyone. And communism had a lot of ideologies to combat itself with. They combated against nationalism, capitalism, religion, private property, social Darwinism, things like that. And these ideas, these concepts were seen, according to Marx, as merely ways of oppressing the working class and distracting them from their real goal of seizing the means of production. Communism is anti-capitalist, anti-nation, anti-religion, in the sense that he believed that these were different things used to keep people busy. Communism finds that capitalism fuels greed, and that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. Communism argues that nationalism is a way of convincing workers to go die in wars, and be distracted from their real problems. Because the argument of Marx is that it isn't nations fighting nations, it is the workers fighting workers in other nations, and that if they could get rid of the shackles of nationalism, all workers could be united instead of pitched against each other. Marxism also hates religion. Religion is seen, since it focuses on the afterlife, according to Karl Marx, that means that it causes the proletariat to overlook their worldly suffering and instead focus on an afterlife. Communism does not care about the afterlife. It is materialistic. It believes that the world as it is, the world we live in as it is the only thing worth focusing on. Whatever lies beyond is either irrelevant to communism or probably a distraction. Now, there are a few communist uprisings between the writing of Das Kapital and the modern era. Most of these uprisings are largely unsuccessful. 1848, the year of revolutions, is particularly a violent time for revolutions. And the goal of communism is remarkably simple in theory. Destroy the current government, overturn all of society's norms that have pinned down the proletariat, and then reform the world from the ashes in this new society. Very tricky to do, very easy to destroy, very hard to create, as we will see. Now, one of the reasons why communism has a hard time with revolutions is there's a lot of people who benefit from the current system being in place, and so there's a lot of people who have good incentive to, well, prevent the world from changing radically. A prime example of this is that often in communist revolutions, when successful, they wind up executing all the former leaders of a nation to prevent them from returning. Private property is seized by the state in the name of the proletariat. And also any resistance to a communist revolution is seen as a threat to the spirit of the revolution, and often results in death or a great deal of suffering for anyone who isn't considered a true communist patriot, revolutionary comrade. And so much like a phoenix rising from the ashes, communism expects a lot of fire when it goes through its fights. But the two biggest communist revolutions to ever succeed are going to be the one in Russia during World War I and the other one in China following World War II. Both nations are going to play a major role in the Cold War, but we're going to focus more on the Russia, Soviet-styled communism in this little lecture. Chinese communism is still a major factor, as communist China is still in existence to this day. So some might say that Chinese communism is a bit more adapted for the world as it is right now, or the world's adapted to it. Anyways, Soviet communism. The Russian Revolution, well, it's actually the correct term is revolutions, because what happens is there's multiple governments overthrown during World War I. But essentially they stem from the dissatisfaction of the Russian people with imperial rule and anyone who can't, well, rule effectively. Russia had revolutions leading up to this. There's a big one in 1905, but the one in 1917 is the one that changes things in Russia. But essentially, the problems that Russia had is that Imperial Russia, under the Romanov family, was slow to industrialize and operated more like a feudal society than a modernizing country in the 1800s and the 1900s, the start of the 20th century. Many Russians were peasants overseen by nobles who were noted for using their tax monies to party. Imperial Russia, for example, is known for having the biggest and grandest parties in the world, all at the expense of the Russian commoners. There was, even though it was slow to industrialize, there was an emerging middle class. Often they were educated in Western places like France and various German territories, and they were increasingly dissatisfied with the imperial controls of the Russian people. There was these interesting ideas coming out of Europe and some place called America called freedom of speech, representation, intellectual freedom. Just some of these things that middle-class educated people started wanting. They felt it would help them industrialize quicker and make more money. Keywords there. The other factors that play a major role is that the public was increasingly perceiving the Romanov family as detached and perhaps not as good of rulers as their God-given right, the divine right to rule, implied they should have been. There's the Rasputin incident, particularly, that really shocked a lot of people's faith in the Romanov family. Then to top it off, we get World War I and continuous famines throughout this time period. And World War I proves to be the nails in the coffin. Essentially, the Emperor of Russia figured that a quick little war and some land gains from taking over Eastern Europe would get the Russians to quit protesting or thinking about the fact that they're starving and continue to accept the century-long rule of the Imperial Romanov family. However, the problem with that is the Germans. The Germans, in particular, made sure that the Russian army suffered dearly in World War I. Since the Russian military wasn't fully industrialized, their troops were often not as well equipped. While very numerous, that just meant in an industrial war, more people died. Particularly problematic is the emperor, thinking he could save things, took personal command of some of the military and proceeded to lead them to have some of the worst defeats in World War I. And as the death rates climbed higher, many Russians began questioning, is this the right family to have in charge? There was the famine as well. That was not popular during the war. And one of the things you'll realize if you study human history, is that the keys to political instability are famine, belief in that the powers that be, the government, is not addressing the problems, and when normal life starts to fall apart, people get upset, and that's what triggers a lot of government overthrows. So to go over those again: famine, poverty, a belief that the government is not fixing the problems that be, and when normal life becomes increasingly untenable, you can't go back to your normal life. Those are the forces. And with those, the Russians in 1917 are hungry, frustrated with the war, worried about the losses of loved ones on the battlefields, and they were cold because, it's Russia. But the Tsar was overthrown. Actually, it wasn't the Soviets that did it. They were part of the revolutionary groups. But what happened is a whole bunch of different groups of people came together, overthrew the Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, and put in a new democratically elected government. It was a very rushed project, and so the degree of democracy that's actually going on in there is probably always up for debate. This new Russian Republic was not addressing the problems, so these problems didn't go away, except for the Romanovs. They were executed. But the belief that the government was fixing problems was not resolved. The Russian Republic still had all those same problems. There was still famine, they stayed in the war, and people just did not believe that this new government was fixing things either. This is where the communists came in. The communists in the Russian Revolution call themselves the Soviets. There's more technicalities to what that term actually means, but think of the communists in Russia as the Soviets. The advantage the Soviets have is they were highly organized, and they were on the peripheral of this new government. And what happened is their intellectuals like Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, they were able to organize a large contingent of communists and waited as the Republic of Russia literally destroyed itself and fell apart. And so as World War I drug on, the Soviets then took advantage to overthrow them in the October Revolution. Once the Soviets were in power, it did take some time to organize. But one of the big problems they fixed pretty quickly is they pulled out of World War I. They signed a separate peace with Germany, got the Russian people out of World War I. They still had to work on these other problems, but they had already taken one more step than any of the other governments before them had. And the Soviets were gradually able to build a sense of trust with their people, partially through propaganda, force, and the fact that they were the only people who were seeming to get things organized. That was a good force. But there are some pictures from the revolution. No. But there's a summary of that. One of the things that really helped the Soviets is they were good at consolidating power. Now, when Lenin unexpectedly died, Joseph Stalin came into power unexpectedly a bit. What really helped him come into power is his capacity for violence. His ability to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, and in many cases his friends, really did wonders to consolidate his power. Things like the Great Purge that we looked at in the previous unit, assassinations of people like Trotsky, concentration camps called gulags, and secret police. These various things allowed the Soviets to consolidate power under Stalin and stabilize Soviet rule. And even though World War II kind of caught them off guard, the Soviets were able to turn that around and organize themselves further. And thanks to World War II, in part, the Soviets were able to export the Communist Revolution, drawing in much of Eastern Europe through occupation, violence, voter fraud, and other means. Czechoslovakia is one of those exceptions. They voluntarily went communist, and then the Soviets absorbed them. But No. Communism under the USSR practices all the hallmarks proposed by Marx. The government seized all private property, all labor was considered equal, workers had homes and jobs, and all industries were managed by the government, and religion was either outright banned or it was heavily restricted. The Soviets under Stalin added a few other things. They maintained order through things like the KGB, the secret police. In their satellite countries like East Germany, they used a secret police called the Stasi. Its citizens were limited in the ability to travel, and to further promote communism as the ideal, they banned other political parties. They generated propaganda. All media, books, movies, things of that such had to be reviewed in order to ensure they promoted communism. If they did not promote communism, they were censored. Additionally, people who spoke ill of the government or questioned communism, Soviet-style communism, they were arrested, disciplined, and reassigned, or in some cases executed. But the Soviets would go through cycles of famines and shortages because occasionally central planning would miscalculate the needs of the people or decided that some needed to be sacrificed for the whole, such as when the Soviets scheduled a famine for the country of Ukraine in an effort to improve the living conditions of Russians. But as a whole, many people are going to actually live fairly normal lives in the Soviet Union. And that's part of the reason for the success of the Soviet Union, is they were able to restore some sense of normalcy, and actually better normalcy than what people had under Imperial Russia. In the Soviet-controlled world, if you didn't question authority, if you overlooked the shortages, you didn't get turned into the state police, there were some perks. All Soviet Union citizens enjoyed housing, employment, and various services like child care. If you were loyal to the Communist Party, you would enjoy more luxurious access because loyalty gave you more privileges in a society detached from private property, religion, and capitalist pursuits. Now, this will be covered more in a future unit, but the Soviet Union would actually dismantle itself as people grew dissatisfied. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, people began to doubt the communist government's ability to respond to their needs. And this is what destabilizes a society, is when the government is no longer perceived as able to address the needs of the people. That seems to be the issue. But ultimately, if we're looking at communism, it is a utopian economic political model. If we're going back up to Marx. Essentially, the way communism works is its goal is to create a perfect world, according to communism. Communists believe that since their way is best, there's no need for other political parties to exist. The USSR banned other political parties, for example, and sent their leaders to gulags or chased them out of the country. Communism is classified as a totalitarian government. And what totalitarian means is that the government seeks to control every aspect of the citizens' life, society, and economy. Communists would often oppose free speech and democratic practices because such things would corrupt the working class and distract them from achieving the true communist utopia. There's no need for alternative ideas in a communist nation under the argument that only communism matters. But that's the finer points of how that all applies is a topic for another day. One of the things that comes up a lot is on socialism. What is socialism versus communism? There are many different definitions. We're going to stick with a more communist view of socialism to understand it, though. So moving on from the Soviet model. Socialism is much more commonplace than communism. And essentially, socialism, according to people like Lenin and Trotsky, is a weaker form of communism. Socialists see themselves as a more reasonable version of communism. Because essentially, communists want to watch the world burn and rebuild from the ashes. Socialists would like to patch things up, but largely keep the world more or less the same. what they change is what they're arguing about. But socialism usually seeks to do political reform within a country instead of violently overthrowing the government and executing the former government officials or jailing them. Socialism seeks to run in fair elections or elections and get into power that way, and then reform the system using the system's rules. Most societies have a way of changing the rules from within. And socialists frequently feel that only certain aspects of the government need to be changed. And they're often more willing to negotiate. As a result, socialists often get elected more often into office. But some examples of socialism where it's found: the United States of America has some socialist elements. We have Social Security, which is where the government manages a retirement fund for all Americans that's paid through their taxes. In various countries in Europe, they have socialized health insurance, such as Sweden is the example we have on the screen. Other cases like that. One thing that is worth noting is, since socialism, the government has more control over things, the socialist countries typically have higher taxes, as many of these services, they need money and it's not cheap to provide to their citizens. Venezuela is an example of a socialist government that's kind of in trouble because a lot of their goods and services are paid through taxes and the profits that would have been made through gas and oil sales. When the socialists came into power in Venezuela, they nationalized the oil industry, and part of how they paid for their services was through oil. So when the price of oil drops, well, that's one of the problems they ran into, is that their government cannot provide the same services it had before. And that's led to incredible instability in the normal lives of many Venezuelans. But anyways, let's wrap this up. This lecture does not seek to explain all the nuances and complexities of communism. It seeks to introduce American students to the concept of how many people live and still live in the world. It introduces some of the basic theories of communism, because there's all different groups. There's Marxists, Leninists, Trotskys, Maoism. So there's different kinds of communism, and we will get into some of that in our class, but not a whole lot of detail because we're a U.S. history class and we can't get too derailed according to the standards of the course. Here's some basics, though. Communists seek to improve the living conditions of the working class. Most communists seek to overthrow the current society. Private property should be eliminated and severely reduced. And the government controls industries in the interests of the working class and oversees them. And that's really enough for now. Various activities will help expand your knowledge of communism and how it fits into our Cold War unit in U.S. history. In any case, I do hope this helps with clarifying a few things. Until later.